I'm going to shift gears here on you just a little bit for this report, and I'm going to dive straight into the mud motor section of this particular report. When we go to the downhole mud motors, one of the first things that you'll notice when you go and you evaluate the downhole mud motor market is you'll begin to realize in downhole mud motors that some of the biggest needs amongst the oil and gas operators is mud motor technology to be continue to improve with longer elastomer survivability at the same power output versus having greater power output with no improvement in elastomer survivability. Operators also prefer, generally speaking, particularly in North America land, to have the downhole mud motors be able to improve and increase torque versus being able to improve speed to be able to spin the bit faster. When we ask the operators what suppliers they're using for downhole mud motors, what we find is amongst the operators that we interview that there's well over 40 different directional drilling suppliers cited as being used globally for downhole mud motors. When you look into the North America land market, the North America land operators are using on average 2 different suppliers. Two different suppliers for the downhole mud motors, and the market's very fragmented. And so as I go through each of these various product lines, mud motors first, then we'll do MWD second, and rotary steerables third. If you have questions along the way, please let me know. When we conduct the interviews, we'll ask the E&P operators what suppliers they're using for the downhole mud motors, and then we'll also ask them to rate the performance of the suppliers with whom they're using on a rating scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being outstanding performance. And one of the first things that you'll notice on this particular graph is that there's quite a big variance between the ratings that these downhole mud motor suppliers are receiving on a scale of 1 to 10 on these key performance measures such as responsiveness to needs, equipment quality, reliability, competency of field service personnel, technical support availability, overall mud motor performance, and pricing competitiveness. You'll see that the worst performing mud motor suppliers are receiving average ratings on a scale of 1 to 10 in the high 6s and low 7s, and that the very best downhole mud motor suppliers are receiving ratings in the high 8s. And so one of the first things that you'll notice through the voice of the E&P operators that are using these mud motor suppliers is that not all mud motor suppliers are performing in a uniform fashion. Some are performing better than others, and that's mostly evident here when you look at this supplier performance trend map here, and this is for North America land. If you take responsiveness to needs, for example, the industry average performance rating is this dash line, where you can see from 16 to 17 all the way to 2020 how responsiveness ratings improved for a period coming out of the last downturn, but then as we started to pick back up in U.S. land market, responsiveness ratings started to decline, going down from 17 to 19. And then you can see how the responsiveness ratings amongst the industry benchmark improved. You can see certain suppliers like Scientific Drilling consistently receiving performance ratings that are higher than the industry average. And you can see other suppliers like Weatherford consistently year in and year out receiving responsiveness ratings amongst the users that are lower than industry average. And so this is a very important graph that I think highlights the observation and the challenge that so many oil companies experience. If you're an oil company and you use 1 or maybe 2 different mud motor suppliers, which is the statistical average, it's very difficult for you to know how the supplier that you're using compares to that of one of the other 30 or 40 other suppliers versus the industry benchmark if you've never used another supplier. Here, when we benchmark these thousands of ratings through the voice of the E&P operators, the voice of the operator peers, you can see that certain operators such as Weatherford and Schlumberger, even Baker Hughes, have consistently underperformed in the area of responsiveness to needs, whereas Scientific Drilling has consistently outperformed industry average. And you can see the same often happens for equipment reliability, technical support, and competency of field service personnel. When you move into the international land market, there's fewer suppliers. And so therefore, you may see the big suppliers like Baker Hughes, Halliburton, and Schlumberger be the dominant suppliers in the market. Weatherford's usually probably the next largest supplier in the international market. You can see a consistent level of underperformance in these markets. When we take these performance ratings and we translate it into the value map that I shared with you as an analysis that we'll be sharing with you here today, what we find here is when you look at the value map with overall supplier performance on the x-axis and pricing competitiveness on the y-axis, what you'll find is Weatherford's commonly performing below industry average in just about all the drilling service product lines that we research. But Weatherford's very quick to use pricing competitiveness that is considered to be a little bit lower than industry norm. So Weatherford's seeking to be a discount provider, or even though they don't perform quite as well as industry average, they offset their performance shortcomings with lower pricing to fall within the fair value fairway that you see running diagonally from the northeast quadrant to the southwest quadrant. Remember, you may recall there was over 40 different mud motor suppliers cited as being used. And when we aggregate a lot of these small mid-tier suppliers into this aggregate column called all others, you'll find that these mid-tier suppliers overall in aggregate tend to outperform and are viewed as being a better value than the big three suppliers, Schlumberger, Halliburton, and Baker Hughes. Scientific Drilling is also considered to be a very consistent performer for directional drilling services. If we segment this, say, by North America land, you can see exactly how competitively disadvantaged Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Schlumberger become relative to suppliers like NOV, Scientific Drilling, and the smaller suppliers in aggregate. If we open this up to some of the second mid-tier suppliers, you'll see companies like MS Directional, Pro Directional, and Scientific Drilling really distinguish themselves through the voice of the customer, the voice of the operator feedback, as being the leading mud motor suppliers that are really viewed as delivering some of the better overall value in the marketplace in the North America land market. So being able to benchmark supplier performance through the eyes of the E&T operators is a very valuable endeavor, and it helps to bring out the differences that not all suppliers perform at the same level, and there are different levels of pricing competitiveness that exist in the market. And so this is a good example through the gift of the feedback of the E&P operators, how we're able to aggregate and demonstrate differences in the competitive landscape for downhole mud motors. Naturally, if you move to the international land market, you don't have 40 different suppliers to choose from, and the market consolidates significantly in terms of the number of suppliers. And you can see that the performance and the overall positioning of Baker Hughes, Halliburton, and Schlumberger begin to tighten up quite considerably. If we move to another topic like measurement while drilling, or MWD tools, what we'll find is that, really one of the key trouble areas that the operators are experiencing with MWD tools is tool reliability and improved transmission rates. We talked earlier about being able to use real-time drilling advisory systems, and as we move towards drilling automation, we're going to have to improve not just the speed of data transmission, but also the reliability of data transmission. And also keep in mind that not all operators drill at the same level of efficiencies. What we find in our research is that some E&P operators can drill a section of well in 24, 30 hours. Other E&P operators may take 50% more time, or even more than 50% more time. And so keeping tools down in the hole for an additional 24, 48 hours oftentimes will be enough to allow them to fail through the shock and vibration. E&P operators are continuing to increase the use of EM and build telemetry. And, there are several MWD suppliers like Evolution One or Evo One that is a key supplier to many directional drilling suppliers out there that have unified or dual telemetry. Again, but for MWD, when we ask the E&P operators what suppliers they're using for measurement while drilling, again, there was a whole plethora of different MWD suppliers that were cited as being used. Again, we had well over 40 different MWD suppliers cited as being used. And you can see that in North America land, international land, the typical E&P operator is using about 1.7 different suppliers. Again, feel free if you have any questions as we go through here to send any chat messages and we'll address them. When you look at the market share distribution for North America land here, you can see that the big three suppliers have about 38–40% of the market share, but 60% of the market share is held in the hands of some of the smaller mid-tier MWD suppliers. This observation also exists for downhole mud motors, even though I didn't show it. And when we get the performance ratings on a scale of 1 to 10 of the various MWD suppliers, just like we saw with downhole mud motors, we see variance between the very worst performing MWD suppliers and the very best performing MWD suppliers. And when we translate this into the performance trends, again for North America land, again you'll start to see evidence of certain suppliers, like for equipment reliability and field service execution, Scientific Drilling continues to distinguish themselves with much better than industry average performance from year to year, from 16, 17, 18, 19, and 2020, whereas some other suppliers continue to demonstrate either really unpredictable or variable performance, or in some cases consistent performance that is performing below industry average, as you see here. And so when you translate this to the value map again, you're going to see significant differences in how that competitive landscape looks like in North America land for MWD. So again, you'll see that the smaller MWD, small to mid-tier MWD suppliers in aggregate in North America land are viewed as delivering the best overall value along with Scientific Drilling. One of the things that you'll notice about Scientific Drilling from year to year is they're consistently positioned here in this value advantage quadrant. Some of the other suppliers you'll see kind of move around quite a bit from year to year. So if we were to track, say, Halliburton, from 2017 here, 2018 here, 19 here, 20 here, you'll see a lot of the suppliers kind of bounce around quite a bit, competitively speaking. You'll see Weatherford moving from 18, 19 performance better than industry average, declining in their performance going into 2020, whereas Scientific Drilling, as I mentioned here, rather consistent performance. And this level of consistency that you see in suppliers is something as an operator that you like to see whenever possible. If you open it up to some of the smaller and mid-tier suppliers for MWD, you would notice that MS Directional, Pro Directional, Cathedral, and Gordon also plot as being value advantage suppliers. If I were to plot, there's Evolution 1 here, EVO 1's up here on the map. If I were to take this x-axis and just focus on equipment quality and reliability, EVO 1 would move far over to the right, because that's really one of their strengths, is being able to handle high levels of reliability. And so again, you can see that there's quite a bit of variance in the competitive positioning of these various suppliers. One trend that you also see is that the big three suppliers, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Schlumberger, in the North America land market tend to be competitively disadvantaged on a consistent basis for downhole mud motors and for measurement while drilling tools versus the smaller to mid-tier suppliers. Again, when you move to the Gulf of Mexico, you see that the performance profiles of the big three suppliers begin to tighten up as they plot in a very similar spatial positioning on the x-axis, which is the performance axis. When you move to the international market, again, you see that the three suppliers start to show some performance difference as their spatial positioning on the x-axis indicates variance, with Schlumberger performing the best and Halliburton performing the worst. But they have pricing strategies that keep themselves within the fair value fairway as being acceptable values overall in the market. In the offshore market, again, you can see how the supplier's performance again begins to tighten up to be very less and less differentiated, and the biggest difference is in the pricing competitiveness. Now, the competitive landscape changes quite significantly when you move the rotary steerable systems, because when you move the rotary steerable systems, a few things that you'll find in rotary steerable systems is that the use of rotary steerable systems continues to grow in North America land. U.S. land is up to 32%. improving the reliability and durability of the rotary steerable systems is continuing to be a focus. But you also find when you get to rotary steerable systems that there's fewer suppliers to choose from. So for rotary steerable systems, unlike what you have for downhole mud motors and MWD, you don't have 40 different rotary steerable system suppliers to choose from. In fact, when you start to look at the market share for rotary steerable systems, you'll find that the big three suppliers, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, and Halliburton, really have the preponderance of worldwide market share. When you get into North America land, though, you begin to realize that Halliburton's iCruise, Scientific Drilling's Halo, and Weatherford's Magnus are all relatively newer rotary steerable systems that have been entering the market to try to provide additional optionality for the E&P operators to choose from, and to help with improved reliability, being able to drill less tortuous well paths for horizontal wells. Scientific Halos has some pretty special capabilities with inclination and azimuth control. And so when we start to take a look at the performance ratings on a scale of 1 to 10, you see that the performance ratings have really tightened up quite a bit between the various suppliers, unlike what you saw for mud motors and MWDs. But you still see quite a big variance on rotary steerable reliability and overall rotary steerable performance. When you take a look at reliability ratings in North America land, and you see some really irregular profiles, performance profiles. You see Halliburton's performance profiles kind of going up, down, indicating that difficulty in trying to hone out the systems, if you will, on reliability. If I were to go interactive in our interactive software on any one of these product lines, you would be able to see, how stable and reliable some of the suppliers' performance ratings are versus industry average, and in some cases how they kind of move around. If I go to rotary steerables for a second, and I focus on just rotary steerables, and I go to, say, supplier performance for a particular supplier, and I might go ahead and change over to rotary steerable suppliers here. And we'll filter this on just the United States land market. And we'll just put on, say, the last 2 years. And you look at Halliburton's performance on equipment reliability on their rotary steerable systems, you can see that they've had ratings of 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, 5s, and 4s. And so you see a very broad swath of some really good runs for Halliburton iCruise and some very poor runs for Halliburton iCruise. If you happen to be an E&P operator that experienced one of the good runs, then naturally your perspective of Halliburton iCruise is going to be very positive. If you happen to be on one of the bad runs, then that will submit. But what you're looking for is more consistency. So if you look at Baker Hughes, you can see how more consistent their ratings are as the standard deviation begins to tighten up. And so it's very important to be able to compare and contrast. And when you see irregular performance patterns like this, these are certainly clear indications that the technology is still trying to be working out some of the kinks. And you can see irregular performance patterns international land amongst the rotary steerable suppliers. Now, when you get offshore, you can see a much more stable performance trend and performance profile as the technical challenges of using rotary steerables in the offshore environment are significantly different than that of the challenges drilling unconventional lateral wells in the U.S. land market. So when you move to the value map for rotary steerable systems, and you move to the North America land market, what you typically find here is most of the market share continues to be in the hands of Schlumberger and Baker Hughes. Halliburton Scientific Scientific Drilling's Halo system and Weatherford's Magnus are considered to be acceptable values, but as you can see from the performance profiles, they're still trying to work out some of the kinks and improve the reliability. When we move to drill bits, what we find in the use of drill bits is many of the operators, particularly in North America land, will use about 3 different drill bit suppliers, particularly for fixed cutter drill bits. And when we look at the market share for U.S. land, we'll find that Baker Hughes, Altera, Halliburton, and Schlumberger all have very strong market penetration rates, with 50% or more of the U.S. land operators having used them in the last year. But Altera continues to kind of lead market share, followed closely by Baker Hughes in the U.S. land market. When we look at performance, we do see some variability, but not quite as much variability as we observed with downhole mud motors and MWD. When we look at performance trends, again, you can start to see certain suppliers like Altera that were performing perhaps at industry average or even below industry average at one point in 2016, how their performance profile has improved from year to year, to where Altera is very commonly viewed as performing better than industry average for many of the performance measures that we track, be it bit durability, reliability, overall drill bit performance. So as you can imagine, when you start to go and you start to look at the overall competitive landscape for fixed cutter drill bits in the North America land market and the U.S. land market, you'll find that Altera has a distinct competitive advantage in terms of overall performance and value versus that of the other drill bit suppliers. We also have the ability, if so desired, to break out our analysis by basin or by company type, small independent oil companies versus large independent oil companies versus major oil companies versus national oil companies. But when you break it out by basin, it's oftentimes telling, because oftentimes you may find some variance from basin to basin in terms of overall performance. When you move into the Gulf of Mexico market, you can see how Baker Hughes and NOV become value advantaged in the Gulf of Mexico market. Whereas if you move into the international land market, you see that the performance profiles begin to tighten up quite considerably. Moving into drilling fluids, which will be our final product line to discuss today, we cover water-based, oil-based, and synthetics. Again, there's quite a few number of drilling fluid suppliers that are being used globally. So it's a very competitive, highly fragmented space. So when you take a look at the market share distributions in the U.S. land market, you can see that it's a heavily fragmented market. One of the things that distinguishes the drilling fluids market is it's heavily price-driven by many customers. But even though it's heavily price-centric and price-sensitive in selection criteria, you can see that the performance ratings actually vary quite significantly, as much or more than for downhole mud motors and for MWD. When you look at the competitive landscape in the United States land, North America land market, what we commonly find is that Newpark is a very consistent performer in this value advantage quadrant for the North America land market, very similar to what we observed with Scientific Drilling for downhole mud motors and for MWD. There are other suppliers as well that are value advantage. Halliburton Baroid is certainly a market share leader and certainly has strong heritage in the drilling fluid space. But what you'll notice is as you move like into international markets, you can see where Halliburton value begins to really strengthen along with Newpark's and others. And so when I move into an overall kind of supplier summary mode here, you can begin to see that Baker Hughes, if you look at their portfolio, Baker Hughes' portfolio and overall performance on a global basis is much stronger for drill bits and rotary steerable systems than it is for their MWD and their fluid system. Okay? You can also see that Gulf of Mexico happens to be a geographic region in which Baker Hughes is competitively and performance advantaged. International offshore happens to be one of their weaker geomarkets. If you look at Halliburton, you can see Halliburton Fluids, the Baroid Fluids, happens to be one of the strongest product lines. Mud motors and measurement drilling as a category tend to be competitively disadvantaged and value disadvantaged in the marketplace. If you take a look at Schlumberger, rotary steerables continues to be a technology strength for Schlumberger, and fluids continues to be probably one of the weaker components of their overall offering. Weatherford consistently plots as performing below industry average, but consistently uses price as a pretty attractive mechanism to help offset their performance shortcomings. And then NOV, National Oil Well Varco, viewed as delivering about industry average performance and value for motors and bits, competitively disadvantaged for fluids. Scientific drilling, as you can see from year to year, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, very consistent performance ratings, better than industry average on most all of the performance measures that are tracked by Kimberlite Oilfield Research year to year. And so with that, I'm going to address a few questions here. Looks like there's a question dealing with what the future activity levels may look like for 2020. You know, really for that question, I think I would probably go back all the way back to the beginning when I looked at operator sentiment. The rate at which operator sentiment declined here is almost like it fell off a cliff. And so it was really rapidly over about a 2-month period, operator sentiment went from being in expansion mode in many regions to being in severe contraction mode. And so I guess the good news, bad news is the fact that we dropped and we reached bottom so quickly allows us to kind of start to move into some form of a recovery moving into the second half of 2020. But in reality, with the oil and gas operators, as you know, sticking with your budgets that you've committed to, we'll probably see more in the second half of 2020 dealing with well repair and the completing of wells that have been drilled but not yet completed. We see material increase in the number of drilling rigs being used not beginning until 2021. I see there's one more question that deals with what's the key buying behavior? Is it more service, price, or technology? I think to answer that question, it may be better for me to maybe go into one of these bar charts like this. We'll find that there is a strong amount of variance between supplier performance for price and for service and for technology. And we also find in our research that when we ask the E&P operators how likely are they to recommend a supplier for future use, what we'll commonly find is, like this happens to be for downhole mud motors, that in North America land, some of the highest statistical correlations that exist for which suppliers are most likely to be recommended is overall mud motor performance and reliability, followed by field service execution and responsiveness. So even though you hear a lot about price being a very key criteria in selecting of one supplier versus another supplier, truth be told, when you start to take a look at the competitive landscape of the various suppliers, a lot of the pricing competitiveness, if you look at the y-axis, is within a very similar band. And some of the biggest variance that you're going to see is in performance. If you look at the variance on the x-axis, ranging from far left where Weatherford is to the far right where MS Directional, Pro Directional, and Scientific Drilling are. And so, if you choose a supplier based on the lowest price alone, you're not necessarily going to end up with the best outcome. And so, clearly, while price is important, what we find is that E&P operators really are looking to discern beyond simply price and trying to identify those suppliers that do indeed, at the end of the day, offer the best technology or the best service. Because if you're going to have downtime on a rig, the additional cost of that downtime is going to usually more than offset any savings that you would have achieved elsewhere by getting a lower price. So price, service, and technology are typically three buying behaviors that we tend to see, but at some point price commonly neutralizes out and performance differentials begin to take hold. I don't see any other questions right now. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the Kimberlite Oilfield Research webinar for drilling services. If you find that this session is valuable or would like to follow up with us directly to answer more specific questions that you may have, let us know. In the future, we will be offering additional webinar updates on other areas, be it artificial lift systems coming out in August with ESPs, rod lift, gas lift, plunger lift. at the end of the year with cementing services and cementing tools, and then probably in July for hydraulic fracturing. And so I would like to thank everyone for attending, and if there's not any other questions, we'll draw this webinar to a close. Thank you very much.